Hey, Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Shannon. I'm excited to chat with you.
Same here. Would you mind just introducing yourself real quick to everybody who's listening?
Sure. My name is Stephanie Skryzowski, and I'm the founder and CEO of 100 Degrees Consulting, and we provide CFO and bookkeeping services to nonprofits around the world.
I love it. I especially love CFOs who have a specific niche because I know I'm talking to an expert in that area. And you said it's 100 degrees. Where does that come from? I'm just curious.
Yes, so there's a story behind that. So I spent about 10 years working inside the nonprofit sector. I was a finance manager and eventually the CFO of an organization that was building schools globally. And so I happened to be in Senegal, which is in West Africa, and I was there to support my finance team there. And one night I was laying in bed. It was midnight. It was literally 100 degrees at midnight. There was no air conditioning. I was laying on a mattress on the floor in a rural community where we were working and kind of hating my life at that point. Like, what am I doing here? Why am I not home, like in air conditioning with my husband, enjoying my summer? Instead, I'm here in Senegal, like, you know, dealing with all the things I'm dealing with at work. And I was miserable because it was so hot. I was so uncomfortable. But the next morning, we went to a very rural community where this nonprofit that I was working with was building a primary school, a brand new primary school in a village that didn't have any school. And so just seeing the joy in the children in the community, knowing that their kids could go to school locally in their community, and be able to get an education where they couldn't before, like it just clicked for me. I was like, this is why. This is why I am uncomfortable. This is why I'm here. This is why I'm enduring 100 degrees at midnight. And so it's really all about like sort of getting outside of your comfort zone. And I feel like that's where impact happens. And I feel like finances are an area that are far outside a lot of people's comfort zone. But if you can manage your finances really well, that's where the impact is going to happen in your nonprofit, in your business. So that's a story.
Okay, that is so cool because I love a good origin story, especially for these names that people have for their businesses. I'm like, there's always a story behind it. That is so cool. And I'm sure that is what fueled your passion for working with nonprofits. Can you tell me a little bit about, I'd say, all right, I'm going to paint a broad picture here of CPAs and CFOs and finance people and say, a lot of them don't necessarily work with nonprofits or they don't see a ton of money in the nonprofits. Like they look at that and say, well, it might be a difficult niche or it might be hard to make money as a CPA working with them. Can you just debunk that myth and tell us how you got so passionate about working with nonprofit organizations?
Yeah. So, I mean, I initially started my career like way back when, right out of college, thinking I wanted to be a lawyer.
Hmm.
And after less than a year of working in a law firm, I was like, yeah, absolutely not. And so happened to meet somebody who ran a nonprofit and was able to get in and working in this organization, did a little bit of everything, including the bookkeeping and the accounting and, preparing the financial statements, presenting to the board. And I just kind of latched onto it. And that's really how the trajectory of my career grew into nonprofits. So it wasn't like I set out being like, okay, I'm an accountant and I'm going to specifically work in this niche. It was more like I landed in the nonprofit sector, found my way into finance and accounting, and then decided to make that my career. But what I would say about CPAs and other finance professionals working with nonprofits, I think there is money there, and here's why: because nonprofits have a responsibility to have a budget. They have to have a budget. They have to have a board of directors that are the fiduciary people that are responsible for the organization's finances. They're like these required pieces. And so finance is usually built into the budget. Like they know that they're going to have to spend money there. Whereas if you think about a small business, because we did work with small businesses for a period of time until we sold that portfolio because we really wanted to just focus on nonprofits. Small businesses, they don't need a CFO. They don't need that support. And so it can be less of a priority. Whereas nonprofits, it's like you actually have to do these things. And so there is money there because it's built into the sort of fabric of how a nonprofit runs. In fact, like I said, for a long time, we worked with nonprofits and small businesses. Our nonprofit portfolio was much more profitable than our small business portfolio. And so that's a part of the reason why we ended up selling it. But what I will say, I think some people may stray away from working with nonprofits because there's a different tax return. There are different rules that nonprofits have to follow. There are, different revenue recognition requirements and lots of different things that are just different than working in the small business space. And I feel like it's a whole new, sort of a whole new area to learn. And you might not have focused on that in the past, so they may avoid it, but there's definitely money there.
Yeah. I mean, it's out of a lot of comfort zones, which I think is, again, like CPAs traditionally, our personality type, if there was one, is technically one of like, well, I'm not going to go down that path. I like to stay safe. I want to be in my little box over here and just do my tax returns. That's most, I would say. But I love that you see it as an area of opportunity to say, hey, there's actually a lot of requirements here that they need help with. And we are the best position to help them do that, as opposed to, oh, there's not a ton of money in that industry or in that area because they're not making a ton of profit and they're not making millions and millions of dollars. So, there's a cap on what I can possibly earn. It's like, actually, there's just like so much impact, so much opportunity that they can provide that I think goes missed a lot. So could you just kind of, for the people listening who are, I mean, most people listening are entrepreneurs, right? And they're thinking about nonprofits in terms of working with one, maybe forming one. What's some advice that you have to understand more about what is required of a nonprofit when it comes to the finances? You just listed a few out, but like, what are the commonly missed, like, oh, I didn't know that, things that are kind of those getches that people don't realize when they try to form or run a nonprofit?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones that I would say is an audit. And so every state in the US has a different requirement for an audit. Some states don't require an audit at all. Some require an audit of all nonprofits, and some have like revenue thresholds or gross receipts thresholds where, okay, if you're bringing in over, say, $500,000 a year, you need to get an audit. And an audit is like no small process. The process itself and paying for it, right? Like this can cost anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000 depending on the size
Wow.
and complexity of the organization. And so it's a lot of work. And I think that organizations or, leaders who are a lot of times nonprofit leaders also sort of fall into it. It's like they have a passion for the work that the organization does. And all of a sudden they're finding themselves leading like this $5 million organization, having no idea like what a nonprofit needs to do to make sure they're compliant. So I think the audit is a big one. I was actually just talking to an organization yesterday who is they're fiscally sponsored right now. They're thinking of rolling off onto their own. And they're like, what do we need to know? And I'm like, well, depending on what state you register in, you may be immediately required to have an audit. And that's a big deal. That's a big process that you need to be ready for. And so I think that's just one thing. The 990, which is the nonprofit tax return, is a whole other beast as well. And there are just a bunch of schedules and things that are specific to nonprofits. You need to really understand the impact of them because the 990 is public information. And so donors, funders, potential organizations that might be giving you grants, they are looking at that tax return and they are looking at certain pieces of it. And the way that you're answering questions and the way that you're filling out schedules could determine whether or not you get money from them. And you need donations and grants to survive as a nonprofit. So I think that piece is super important, that the financials are kind of really tied to the big picture and the survival of the organization.
Yeah. And selfishly, I'm so excited I get to be in this host position because on behalf of anyone listening, I'm also learning this too. And I don't know a ton about nonprofits. There's a bunch of like myths I have in my head that I know probably aren't true, but I don't know the real on it. Like I don't know the alternative. And one of those things that popped up for me was, well, can I just start a nonprofit to get out of taxes? I see that all the time where people say, it's okay, I'll start a nonprofit and I'll funnel a bunch of my money through that. And then I can avoid a ton in taxes. In my mind, I'm going, that can't just be a thing you can just do overnight and for fun or off to the side. Can you kind of either debunk that or just kind of explain why people are using that as a strategy or how to do it effectively?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, it's not an easy feat to start a 501c3 nonprofit organization in the US. It's not like when you went to go get your EIN for your business for the first time, where it's like, okay, you fill in a couple things online, boom, here's your EIN. It's not like that. There's a lot of paperwork that goes into the 501c3 application, and it takes a lot of time to even get that, to get your 501c3 nonprofit designation. There are requirements like you have to have a board of directors. And so who's going to be on your board? If you're starting a nonprofit just to, save money on tax, well, you need some other people. You need a mission. Like, what does your nonprofit exist to do or to help or to serve? I think that's huge. And then, okay, let's say you come up with a mission, you come up with a board of directors, you go through the paperwork, you get your 501c3 charity designation status with the IRS. Well, now what? So, okay, now you can donate to this 501c3, but nonprofits cannot have just one donor, because then you're not really a public charity, right? If you're being funded by one donor, AKA yourself, you're not really a public charity. And so as the 990 asks that question, it needs to see a diversity of donors, to make sure that it's basically not like a tax harbor for people wanting to shelter their money in it. And so, no, it's not a simple like, cool, I made a bunch of money this year, let me start a nonprofit to like save some money and tax. Like, that's just not how it works. It's a much
No,
bigger process than
no, it's more than what TikTok would tell you.
that. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's important too, is that it should be mission driven. And I know anyone listening who's thinking about, they saw this episode and thought, hey, I want to start a nonprofit. I want to learn about this. Talk to me about how people kind of go through that process of starting, because I know that I'm sure you work with a lot of entrepreneurs and people who just want to further their mission and don't really know what they're getting themselves into. Don't really, but between the audits, the tax return, and some other things like fundraising, right? Forecasting, knowing like what is going to happen. Talk to me about like the unexpected things that are responsibilities of the owner of a nonprofit and how you can help with that.
hmm Yeah, I think the fundraising piece is huge, right? Because okay, we've determined what our mission is and who we're helping or who we're serving with the work that we do, but now we need money to be able to actually make that happen, and it's got to come from more than just us. So whether that's individuals, right? You can tap your network for fundraising, or whether that's more institutional funders like foundations or corporations, or even state or federal governments have lots of grants available as well. And some of those come with their own set of requirements, right? So if a foundation gives you $100,000 to further your mission, well, there probably are some strings attached to that money, right? Either it's restricted for a specific purpose or during a specific time period, or there's reporting requirements. So that's the other thing with nonprofits. When you think about your business and revenue, there's no strings attached to like the revenue that comes in, right? You provide a service or sell a product and you get the money for it, and that's that. But once any profit, you can do whatever you want with it. Whereas like there's strings attached to money that comes in for nonprofits. And so I think that piece is huge. And then cash flow is a challenge for a lot of nonprofits as well. You're relying on other people to give you money, and other people are not that reliable a lot of the time. And so even if somebody promises, oh yeah, I'll send you that $100,000 check in April, it's July, you still haven't seen that $100,000 check, there's not a lot that you can do about it. It's like you are reliant upon the whims of others. And so cash flow is a huge challenge for nonprofits. And so what we do is help organizations forecast their cash flow and ride those ups and downs. We help them build a cash reserve. Most nonprofit organizations in the US have less than 3 months of cash on hand, and many have less than 1 month. And so we are like, operate coasting into fumes for payroll, basically, is what a lot of nonprofits are doing, because cash flow is so challenging. And so we help with cash flow forecasting, and that piece is huge. A lot of nonprofits come to us because they don't understand how important financial management is. We're sort of operating from our heart, like, let's achieve our mission, let's have the impact that we want to have on whoever we're serving, but then we kind of forget about the financial management piece until we don't have any money to make payroll. We don't know when the next donation is coming in. So yeah, those are just a few of the challenges of nonprofits.
Yeah, and cash flow issues permeate so many different areas too, because if you think about it, if you're not managing cash flow effectively and payroll suffers, then you can't hire top talent, or the talent that you have is going to burn out, because when you're driving towards a mission and you're definitely thinking with your heart, eventually they have to pay their rent, utilities, and bills too. And
Yes.
now it kind of circulates back into, well, if we don't also make money, we can't fulfill on the mission and we can't keep these lights on, you know?
Yeah.
I think that people, they neglect, and I want to get into this a little bit later, but they neglect the business side of running a nonprofit. They think it's basically that simple. And the other thing you hit on, which was interesting, and I was thinking about this, is these aren't customers, they're donors. And the key difference between collecting from customers is hard enough if you don't have an auto pay schedule, right?
Yes.
But add the fact that you're not giving them anything tangible.
Yeah.
So now that you have no leverage, really, you're just kind of like asking really nicely for their money because they are gifting it to you. There isn't like
Yes.
a quid pro quo transaction. There isn't like a ton of consideration in a contract somewhere that says, you must pay me, I give you service or product. It's hard enough being a business owner when you have that leverage on them for them
Yeah.
to pay you. Now we're talking about them just on a whim. And then if their cash flow gets tighter, guess who gets cut first? Or that discretionary spending that goes to the nonprofit. So that makes it even harder for them to operate, which, to your point, like circling back to, this is why I would say they need even more savvy in the financial management space than most do, because they've got a lot of tides working against them sometimes.
Absolutely. I can't tell you how many times I've seen an organization have a gala, right? Like a big event, a big fundraising event.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
the wine's a flowing at those events. The cocktail is a flowing. And during the auction, people raise their hand and pledge, like, yeah, I'm going to give you $50,000 for this. How many of those are like not collected, and there's not a thing that you can do about it?
Yeah, it's like
Somebody
it's like being out for a night drinking and all the best friends you met in the ladies' room that you Facebook
exactly.
friended, and then the next day you're like, who the hell are these
Who
people?
is this?
You're riding the
Exactly.
high. You're
Exactly.
riding the high in the moment, and you're like, yes, emotionally making decisions in the moment, because why? We're tapping into emotions with nonprofits. We're tapping into those hearts.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, those emotions expire. And then logic kicks in. So it's kind of like, before you go to bed tonight, make the check clear.
Exactly, exactly. I know. And a lot of, they take credit
Mm,
card information and stuff, but I've seen lots of like
yeah.
raised hands at galas that never amount to anything. So yeah.
That's unfortunate too. I would hope more ethical behavior comes into play with that, but it is human behavior at the same time. And it's also, and do you see this other issue too with cash flow? I see it with business owners. I think we have like the exact same experience with people because they're human. And it's that, they see the hands go up, they get excited. And the nonprofit's already making plans of what to do with that money, or maybe already committing money they have not collected, or understanding the difference between pledged and collected. Just like an entrepreneur has to understand between sold and collected. Can we talk about
Yeah.
that for a second?
Yeah. Well, the tricky part is that nonprofits have to report their financials on GAAP on an accrual basis.
Mm.
And that means when something is pledged in writing, not necessarily like the hand raised at the gala, but like when somebody sends you an email and tells you, I'm going to give you $100,000, that goes on the books, like because we have it in writing. And that is
Ah,
accrual, like GAAP
right.
rules. That is what we have to do. And so I have seen organizations really get themselves into trouble because accrual financials look freaking awesome. You're like, we are doing so well. And executive directors will present these pretty looking financials to the board. So the board thinks everything is going great. Meanwhile, we're like barely able to make payroll because none of this is cash in the door. And so that is huge, and a piece that a lot of organizations do not understand the difference between cash and accrual accounting. And so,
Hmm.
what we do is like, yes, we manage the financial statements on an accrual basis. We use all the right revenue recognition, practices and whatnot. And also we have a cash flow forecast, because just because John told you he's going to give you 100 grand doesn't mean it's coming anytime soon. And so we need to forecast for that appropriately versus just looking at this like pretty income statement that has a bunch of revenue on it, but actually is not cash collected at all. And so that's something that we have to teach over and over again is accrual versus cash. There's a big difference here, and you need to know it, and you need to track both because one is not enough.
Yeah, and like you said, we have to be, you know, don't throw the party just yet when someone pledged for, a certain amount of money. And even though it goes on the books, like, yay, we earned that from an accounting standpoint, from an accrual standpoint, which is so important to understand that accrual, guys, is conceptual accounting. It's like the idea that we earned it happened and therefore it's income. And that's the hard part, is that until that's cash, you can't do anything with that income. It's just an idea of income. It's an IOU. And that doesn't pay the bills. Cash
Mhm.
pays the bills. So
Mhm.
so important to understand that even with that heart center and that mission, it's like that makes it even harder, I think, for nonprofits to understand, because I would say typically if you're in the nonprofit space versus business, then you may not be as financially savvy, may not be as business minded, and may be already kind of easily coerced into thinking that that is better than it is because you got these rosy colored glasses on, as you said, Stephanie. So it's like
Mhm.
there's so many things that you have to be kind of like brought back to center. Like, no, actually it's this way.
Mhm.
And kind of pulled back onto the right path of moving forward financially. I love that. I absolutely love that. And I wanna shift gears into kind of that human aspect we talked about, because we're talking about mission driven people mostly. And a lot of the times there's fear around, like, well, asking for money, fundraising, and I'm doing this for the passion of it. I'm not doing it for the money. How does that get in the way, that mindset get in the way of nonprofit runners? And how do people kind of navigate that and overcome that?
Yeah, this is a huge challenge in the nonprofit sector. And it's this scarcity mindset versus abundance, right? With the scarcity mindset, we think there's a limited pie, limited resources, and, there's only a certain amount that we can all go after. And that sort of trickles into how we're operating the nonprofit, in that we're like, well, we have to scrimp and save and pay as little as we can to our employees, and like not give them benefits because we're just here for the mission. Every dollar has to go to the mission. And a low administrative overhead rate is like what we're going for. But I think we all know, like, actually, before I continue, and that idea is perpetuated by funders who are looking for a low overhead rate. It is perpetuated by, the 990 that is looking at that, separating out your program versus administrative overhead expenses. And so you can calculate that, like, oh, if it's over 10%, like that's bad. Charity Navigator and the Better Business Bureau, who are sort of like charity watchdog organizations, have guidelines, or at least they had, I haven't looked at it in a little bit, they had guidelines. They want your admin expenses to be under a certain percentage. But we all know what that means. That means that you're not investing in your people, you're not taking care of your people, and you don't have sufficient infrastructure in the organization to be able to really grow. And so this is that scarcity mindset that is just sort of permeated throughout the entire sector. And what that means then is that when we are fundraising, we are often not thinking big enough and not asking big enough. And so if there's a potential for a donor to give $100,000, we're like, well, let's just ask for 50, because like we can make do. It's fine. Like we can fit what we need to, cram it all into this 50 instead of 100. And so I work with one organization that is just fantastic. I've worked with them for about 7 years, and they're doing really well financially, honestly. It seems like every single week they're getting a new 6-figure grant, 7-figure grant. This year is fully funded. Next year is getting close to fully funded as well. And I asked their CEO, I'm like, how do you continue to get money from donors, existing and new donors, when like you have a huge cash reserve? You have this year and next year funded. How do you continue getting more money? And she's like, well, the problem that we are trying to solve, it's not a $10 million problem. This is a $50 million problem. So sure, we have $10 million. We're like 20% of the way there, but this is a $50 million problem. And so we're talking about this big vision and asking people to be part of this big vision versus like, oh, can you give us $20,000 to like fund whatever this year? Like they think really big and invite funders, invite donors to come along this like big picture vision with them. And I just think that's huge. And not enough organizations, not enough nonprofit leaders are thinking big and talking about their vision in that way.
Yeah, I think it's kind of that short-sightedness of wherever the next dollars are coming from. And that organization you just described is like, where's the next 10 million coming from? And
Yeah.
they're really like 10xing their thinking, 100xing their thinking on how they can actually get to that point and make a real impact. As opposed to making those micro steps one at a time, they're seeing it for the horizon and going, how do we get there faster, as opposed to
Yes.
how do we just get to the next stop on the bus? And
Yes.
I think that's so important for anyone to be thinking about, is to have such a big vision that you can enroll other people into it,
Mm-hmm.
and have people just jump on the bus and go on with you and say, we're heading in that direction. We know exactly where we're going. We have the destination programmed for the future, not just the next stop.
Mm-hmm.
And that's huge. It's just having that
Mm-hmm.
long-term vision. But I think that also it goes hand in hand, because what you were just describing, it makes me think of, well, if I'm an investor slash donor, right? I go, well, I want to know that they have that money and that they're going to accomplish it. It's more likely that they will accomplish what they're saying they're going to do. If I can see that they have such a big reserve, I'm going to be more inclined to give them more money, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at that going, that's a machine that works. I would put
Mm-hmm.
money into a slot machine that worked.
Yeah.
Right? Versus one that looked like it could be broken. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's not like we need the money more. It's we're better at managing it. And
Mm-hmm.
we can further this mission. It's like what you just said, that like, but we need it so badly. We have a scarcity mindset when you're operating out of desperation versus out of the plan.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah. And, I love that point about donors being more confident that you'll actually be able to accomplish what you set out to accomplish, if you have more money, if you manage it well, versus just using your donation to like, oh shoot, well, we got to divert this because we're not going to make payroll next week. So you wanted it to go towards this big thing. Well, sorry, we got to pay our people. Like that's not, yeah, that's very short-sighted.
Yeah, I mean, like I think of it as an investor mindset and go, if I'm going to give someone my money, I want to make sure that not necessarily I'm going to get a return on it, because nonprofits don't work that way, but I want to know if I'm putting money into that, I am investing in the vision. I'm investing in that thing happening. I'm not going to just give them money and say, pay your people with this, and I hope you eventually don't close. Like that's not what any donor is thinking. They want to make sure we're
No.
contributing to the mission and seeing it come to fruition. On that note, so in redirecting that to the mission again, I think about donors and their enrollment in the mission. I think a lot of nonprofits, in my experience on the other side, I've been a donor to a few nonprofits, and I always wonder, like, I wish there was more donor relations of getting more donors to help further the mission and to enroll other donors in and to help fundraise and to actually get them involved in seeing the byproduct of what they're doing. How are you seeing organizations kind of integrate all of that and to help fundraise more and maybe multiply fundraising by saying, hey, we don't just cash checks, like you can come and actually see what we're doing over here. I personally donate more to organizations where I can see what they're actually doing and feel like I'm part of that and have that visual of, hey, we helped contribute to that. How does that
Mhm.
play into the organizations you work with?
Yeah, I think the first thing on like a sort of very base level is communicating with your donors and with your funders. And it seems so simple, but it just like does not happen enough. Where you have this regular cadence of communication, not just asking for money, but like, hey, here's what we're working on right now. Hey, here's a challenge that we've encountered. Hey, here's what this new school that we built looks like. So that regular communication, again, just like in your business with your customers or potential customers, that regular communication is huge, and not just asking for money. You don't want to be that organization that your donors get an email twice a year from you on Giving Tuesday and at year end asking for money, right? So
Yeah.
that's number one. The second piece is I've seen some organizations actually invite, and I work with a lot of international organizations. So I've seen some organizations actually invite their funders to come to a country where they're working, come to Ghana and see the schools that we are building and the programs that we are running in Ghana. And so people will do that. They will travel around the world. Funders will do that and say, yeah, I can see exactly where my money is going. And so even it doesn't have to be that big. Even if you're working locally, how could you invite people to come be part of your community in person? I think all funders would love that, because once you get a taste of that impact, you're like, oh my gosh, this is what you're doing. Yes, here's more money. Like take all my money.
Yeah, it builds trust because it's like I can actually see where it's going and I feel better about putting more in, knowing where it's going to go. And I think that's true of any investment. If you can see where it's going to, you're more inclined to keep multiplying that investment or that donor or that donation. And for those listening who are thinking, I'm thinking of starting a nonprofit. I would love to have a bigger mission and passion be part of what I do. How can I incorporate that into what I do currently? Should I start a nonprofit? Is that an option? Can you just talk to them who are just thinking, I would love to incorporate this in. I have no idea how to get started or if this is the right solution for me.
I would first start by asking yourself, what is the goal? Is the goal to make an impact? If so, is there already an organization that is doing and having the impact that you want to have and doing it really well? There are tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of nonprofits in the United States who have, a lot of them, been doing this work for decades and have experts on the ground who know what they're doing, who know exactly how to create the impact. And so just because you want to have an impact, I love that so much, but I would say start with what already exists and how can I support them? So maybe it's monetarily, because yeah, it's a tax write-off to make a donation to a 501c3 nonprofit. It doesn't have to be your own. So maybe you make a donation, maybe you volunteer your time, maybe you volunteer your expertise, or if you've got, people on your team that could volunteer. So I think there's ways to be a part of a nonprofit without starting one. And I think that a lot of nonprofit leaders would actually give that same advice. Like, don't start a nonprofit, whatever you do, just support one that already knows what they're doing and already exists, because they could probably use your help. So I would say start there. If you find that, like, okay, well, there's nobody doing exactly what I want to be doing, there is also the opportunity to be fiscally sponsored. And so that means there are organizations that are already nonprofits called fiscal sponsors, and they will often take on projects like yours. Perhaps if you have a project that you want to do that's going to help somebody that doesn't already exist as a nonprofit, and they are essentially the nonprofit like umbrella, and you're under them, and so they receive the tax deductible donations on your behalf, pass them through to you. They manage the audit if needed, the 990, your tax return, all of the logistical stuff, so you can really focus on the impact of your project. I would say that would be like the next thing. And then if that's not your jam, then think about starting a nonprofit. But because earlier I mentioned that, there are so many steps that you have to go through to really make sure you're setting up a nonprofit the right way, and being legally compliant. Like, just whipping out a 501c3 is like not the first step, I would say.
No, it's not like an LLC. You can't just like
No.
show up and apply for it and expect to get it. And it's not to discourage folks from doing that. It's more just understanding the requirements and knowing that there are other options depending on what your goals are. And that's really the message we want to get across, is that it doesn't have to be there's no one size fits all. And I think that most people hear about the 501c3. They know about that. So that's what they'll go to immediately. But I didn't even know about the fiscal sponsorships. I'm like, that makes a ton of sense, because it might be the best of both worlds for people who are just spending so much time on their business. And I also have a mission I want to fulfill, but I can't dedicate all that time. That might be a great compromise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the organization I was talking to recently that is still fiscally sponsored, they have $3 million in annual revenue for their nonprofit or their organization. And they're still working with a fiscal sponsor. They're thinking about rolling off onto their own now. But I mean, we've worked with fiscal sponsors as well who have, half a dozen or, maybe 20 different projects under them. And it's really easy for those projects to get started and start bringing in, tax deductible donations and get going on their work without having to go through the whole painful process. And then if it turns out it's like, you know what, this project was great for a season, but now I think I'm done. It's a lot easier to move on from that than to have to shut down an entire 501c3 entity.
I totally agree. But what's cool is what you just mentioned, which is that they can start as one and they can move into a 501c3. So it's kind of like proving the concept and then like waiting until you commit to that to make sure that it's something that you feasibly can and want to do once you understand the time commitment. It's almost like a trial run of like dipping your toe in and saying, I want to give this a whirl. Hey, this is working. We're going to move to a full 501c3 organization, but then you'll have the capital to get help with that. You'll have the capital to hire somebody like Stephanie to do the forecasting for you. And you won't be just caught going, oh my God, all of these requirements. And I'm basically emptying out my bank account to start this thing and starting from scratch and having to chase more fundraising. It's a ton of work. Now, is it worth it? Sure. If you're really, really passionate about your mission, it could be worth it. It's a heck of a lot easier though when you don't have the e-brake on the whole time you're driving.
Yes.
We want to make it as smooth as possible, right?
Yes.
Stephanie, I love this. How can folks learn more about what you do and how you help nonprofits if they're interested in working with you or just learning more from you?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the best place to go is 100degreesconsulting.com. That's 100 like the number 100. And at 100degreesconsulting.com/cash, we have a free cash forecasting template. So if you're like, ooh, forecasting, I need to do that. I'm not currently doing that. Go grab that. 100degreesconsulting.com/cash.
Amazing. Guys, that link is in the show notes. Go grab a copy. And even if you're not a nonprofit, even if you just need a cash flow forecasting template, this is not, only for nonprofits. This is a great habit for everybody. So grab a copy of this. Again, just grab the link in the show notes and download it. Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.